Sorry, Michelle, were you about to say something?
That's it. No, it's fine. I was going to say good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Top Tips for Report Writing in Pharmacovigilance. I'd like to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Seema Jaitly, Managing Director of Essjay Solutions. Seema has been specialising in pharmacovigilance for 20 years and has headed up global medical affairs and the PI signatory for many large organisations before setting up Essjay Solutions. Essjay Solutions services span both consulting and contracting to provide solutions to drug safety, research and other affairs relating to the running of a business within the pharmaceuticals industry. Seema, over to you.
Brilliant. Okay, so thank you very much. Thanks for attending today. Hopefully I'm going to cover some top points which you can take into account when you're writing your PSURs and your PBRERs. I use them interchangeably. Moving on, I think I just wanted to highlight what was out of scope. So I'm not going to cover submission timelines or the different authorizations such as your generic authorizations. We're really focusing here on writing the report itself. I'm not going to talk about the EU reference dates for harmonization and the single assessment, but maybe we can cover that at a later point in time. So I do think it's worthwhile looking at exactly what the objective of the PSUR is. Really, it's meant to be a comprehensive analysis of the product benefit risk overall, looking at interval data in the context of cumulative information. Also, especially now with the new legislation, you do need to look at how the product is used in the real world setting once your product is on the marketplace. So you have your pre-marketing data, you have your clinical studies, but what happens when your product is actually on the marketplace? If we move on, I think overall, if we look at the general principles for preparation, and these all come from ICH, I'm sure you're aware of them. You need a single PSUR for a medicinal product with the same active ingredient, and that's really regardless of the indication and route. You should have one PSUR for one active ingredient. As I've already said, you need to put your cumulative data in since the granting of your marketing authorization and the interval data as well for that time period that you're reviewing, and basically contains a summary of the significant safety and efficacy information to do with your product. I think Module 7 and ICH E2C is very good to use as a structure. They're very much the same, and they really form the basis of how the report should be put together. Okay, so looking at points for preparation, I think the one thing really to think about when you're putting this report together is to think about what the regulators receive, because if you think about it, the old style PSUR, what you would get is your line listings at the back, which had some amount of information that the person could go through, whoever received the report could go through, look at the data elements and actually do their own assessments. And you've now moved to a report that has more summary tabulations in the back as the appendices, and that's really the only data source that you've got to go by. So anything that's not quite right in those tables, as in, that looks a bit strange, looks a bit odd, would need explaining within your report, because that's where whoever's reviewing that report is going to go to look at what needs further assessment. I do think it's really important to understand your data, look at what listings you are reviewing, understand exactly where they've come from, what's included. I think understanding your product is extremely important. You need to really know your product, your patient population, because you can put things into context then. You know really what you're looking at as far as your data goes. It's a bit like signal detection. Without knowing your product, without knowing your patient population, it's hard to pick out anything that might be an issue. Is there an RMP? You'll need to ensure that there's consistency there with the risks that are in your risk management plan. If there's a drug safety update report as well, if you've got clinical trials going, then again, you'll need to ensure consistency there. They are modular, so there will be modules that, or parts of the PBRER that will be relevant or could be included within the DSUR, and it's important to ensure that there's consistency. And another thing is now with the PBRER, before the PSUR used to be very much written by probably more medical writer in the safety department, whereas now there's so much cross-functionality in there, everybody needs to input appropriately and write different sections as well, that you need to know who is responsible for providing what types of data elements. And usually you do have either a startup or a kick-off meeting to discuss exactly who's going to provide what types of information within the report itself. Okay, now as a starting point, so you're going to sit down to look at the data before your actual data lock point. I would really start off by looking at the last assessment report, and it's important to look at that to ensure that you have covered all the requests from the regulatory authority previously. I mean, there's no point putting a report together if you haven't gone back and made sure that you have fulfilled all of those requests that have been asked of you in this report. And you may need to then look at what further searches you might need to do on your database to ensure that those requests are fulfilled. You would then look at the data, and step one, I think, is really looking at your interval versus cumulative data, and we'll come on to that in a little while. But then you will have your other outputs as well. So, your fatal, your medication errors. I pick out medication errors specifically. Again, I'll come on to that. Special populations, your pregnancy, lactation, pediatrics. But importantly, make sure that you have got the relevant data for your missing information and your important potential and identified risks. Because although you will be looking at your interval and your cumulative data, you also need to look to see what's changed for your missing information and your important risks within the interval as well. Step two then is based on reviewing all of the step one information and thinking to yourself, right, what else do I need to look at now that I've looked at, all of those outputs? There'll be other things then I need to now look at. So maybe there are things that come up when you do look at that interval and cumulative data table. And I will come on to that to show you what I'm talking about. And then you will say, right, actually I need to look at X, Y, Z. We need to run some other listings so I can look at those cases to make sure that there are no issues there. Okay, now I thought what would probably be useful is to just go through bits of the PSU. I'm not going to cover every section because there's no point going through the introduction and the marketing authorizations, etc., because those are quite standard. They haven't really changed that much from the old style PSUR to this. So I just thought I'd touch on exposure to start with and use patterns, because this did change. Now you do need, whilst you always needed a fairly accurate estimate, I think now you need to really go down into a lot more detail. You need to really look at how your actual use differs from your indicated use, and you also need to look at how you're calculating that exposure. And if you change that method for calculation, you need to state that. Stratification, where possible, is required, and whilst that probably was required or preferred, I should say, in the old format, I think now it is probably more of an expectation that you would have some degree of stratification in there. Within this section, you also have the other post-authorization use, and this really looks at your pattern of use overall and covers areas such as overdose, abuse, misuse, or anything that's above, or outside of the reference product information. So we move to the next slide. Now, the points to consider for exposure is really where you're going to get your data from. And it depends on your product, depends on how old your product is. If it's a new product, you're probably going to have a lot of clinical data available. Useful to have your statistician there then to help you to stratify that information. If it's an older product, you may well not have that clinical data, and you might need to go to some of your older documents like your clinical overview. You do need to agree or consider how you're going to present that data and take into account, though, the use of your product. So your indications, your formulations, if there are different uses in different territories, look at how you can present that. So it's very clear how the product is being used in the post-authorization setting. And I think, again, I've put here the different patient populations, your elderly, pediatric. It is useful to have that, because if you have risks or missing information in certain areas, it will help perhaps to say that actually, if we've got a huge elderly population, maybe this isn't then missing information, because we do have data here, we do have exposure there. If you have a risk that, say, in the pediatric population, it's a very small exposure, then the impact of that risk might not be as significant if it's a huge exposure. So it is useful to do this and do it properly. It can be quite difficult if you have older products to actually get that stratification. I mean, if we look, this is just an example of the tables to give you an idea that, this is the kind of exposure that is expected. This is an example from clinical studies, and you can see it's divided up into your medicinal product, comparator, placebo, and then your demographics below. And this one is your marketing experience, and you can see it's divided up by indication and then any other stratification depending on what you have available. I think where your indications are quite different, you should aim to get that level of detail. We talked about patterns of use because that is included in section 5, and you do need to look at your different sources and where you will get this information from. And this can include things like market research, surveys, IMS data. More often than not, especially if it's an older product, literature articles will provide a source probably for real-world use. And you need to look at where you include that information. You can include the information in the literature section and cross-refer here. Okay, so next we come on to the summary tabulations. Now here, this is quite new. Again, this is section 6. New in the sense that before we were used to presenting narratives from, your SIOMS reports, a lot of detail, a lot of data within the PSUR. Now, though, you present these summary tabulations, and everything is kind of based on those summary tabulations and the analysis and the assessment of those tabulations. So, I mean, again, this is from module 7, it's from ICH, E2C. There's nothing much that's very different from the old PSUR format, because you always needed to talk about your version of your dictionary, etc. You need to say what wasn't included, but it's very clear that this section is not for analysis, it's not for conclusions. You are not meant to put narratives in here, as in your narratives, as in your traditional SIOMS narratives should not be in here. I'm just going to move a couple of slides ahead. I just want to show you what the tables look like, because this is what the regulator is going to see. They're going to see this for your clinical studies, see serious adverse events from your studies or something similar, where you have your system organ class, and then you can see medicinal product, blinded, active comparator, placebo, etc. So it gives you an idea of what SAEs you're seeing from your studies. Then when you come to your post-marketing experience, you can see here that you've got your SOCs, you've got your PTs, and you've got your interval and your cumulative data. And again, what you'll probably, for those of you who have written PSUR or PBRER, you will probably have something similar maybe to this. I know it's a bit small and I apologize, but I'm hoping that you can see this. It's just to give you a feel of what outputs you may get from your database. So here you can see we're looking at spontaneous cases. You've got cardiovascular SOC there, ventricular arrhythmia, atrial fibrillation. Maybe this product has been on the marketplace for 10, 15 years. So cumulatively, we've got 24 ventricular arrhythmias, but we've got 12 in the interval period. And you can see that if you were looking at that and that's all you had, you'd be thinking to yourself, there's something not quite right here, obviously, unless it was listed. But even if it was listed, it looks like it's a bit strange you're seeing that many in the interval. And these are the kind of things that you need to look for. You need to look for where there's an increase in that of an event in that interval, and can it be explained? Is there a reason behind it? You also need to look at those events that are more related to perhaps, your medications, such as things like SJS, anaphylaxis, especially, if they're not labeled. And I've just added, SJS here. You've got one case, so that you've not seen anything cumulatively. Again, it might be worthwhile looking at that, because you'd be saying, okay, you've got one case, maybe two cases. What's going on there? SJS, you'd probably want to, you feel a bit uncomfortable when you see something like that. Now, one way that you can get a feel of what's going on with your data is to maybe look at percentage-wise numbers that are seen in the interval compared to your cumulative number, your cumulative amount. And I know that's not ideal, and I'm sure mathematically there'll be tons of reasons why that's not 100% accurate. However, it gives you a flavor, and that's what you're looking for. You do have to take exposure into consideration. There's so many things you do have to take into consideration, but it just gives you a pointer of what perhaps you might want to look at further. So you could see here for ventricular arrhythmia, 50% increase. If I was looking at this report without any of the data and I only had this table, I would expect something to be in the body of the report to say, ventricular arrhythmia was reviewed, there were no issues, something that shows you've looked at that. Okay. So going back a couple of slides, sorry, they're slightly out of sequence, looking at points to consider for your summary table. So it's what we've just been saying: increased frequencies in the interval, any events that may cause concern that haven't been reviewed previously. It might be that they're out of your signal detection kind of time, but you haven't quite got to those cases yet. Anything that might cause concern, you would expect to see that looked at, and if appropriate, it needs to be described in the PBRER somewhere appropriately. Okay. And I think you do need to decide where you're going to present your top line reviews. I've put narratives here, but when we say narratives, we mean more of an assessment of that area. And depending on what you're looking at, it can be a top line assessment or a detailed assessment. Okay. So moving on. So medication errors now. Medication errors is section 9, and importantly here, you do have to include medication errors. What you need to look at though is that your standard search, you'll get an output, what PTs are used, but you will probably, likely, need to do a further analysis to really classify what you're seeing, because a medication error can be so many different things. And overall, you're looking for a pattern. You need to really look at the cases that you've received and try and classify them with regards to, say, is it down to preparation? For example, have we got, somebody crushing tablets, someone diluting this, doing that? So it's down to preparation. There's an issue with preparation. Is it down to administration? Is it down to dosage, that people are not taking the right dosage or upping it suddenly when they should be tapering it off? And that will vary depending on the product that you have, and it's worthwhile taking a step back, thinking about your product and thinking about the types of medication errors you might be likely to see with your product, and really categorizing them appropriately so that you can look for a pattern. Now, I have used spreadsheets previously where you've got one level where you might look at, say, increasing a dose, decreasing a dose, missed dose, but that would all then go to dosage. But then when you come to write that up, it makes it much easier, because you can say, 3 events were related to dosage, 1 increased dose, 1 reduced dose, 1 missed dose, no pattern was seen. And it's about patterns. That's what you're looking for overall, and anything that you can change with regards to your product labeling to make it safer to take your product or to prevent these types of errors occurring. Okay, moving on to literature. Now, literature, I think, as we know, is a different search to your ICSRs. Usually, it's worthwhile doing this on a regular basis, but monthly is more usual than your weekly that you have to do for your ICSRs and your cases. It's worthwhile considering whether you need to do a review for class effect as well, depending on the product that you're covering. And it's really meant to look at important new safety information. But you do have to look at other things too. So you have to look at your new information on important risks and missing information, because you are meant to be reviewing them as part of your paper. You need to look at real-world use, and I would say that's through your non-interventional clinical studies. There'd been talk about off-label use and picking out interventional clinical studies. However, these are different. They're not, they're in a controlled environment, so they're not true off-label use. Non-interventional studies, where they show how your product's used in the real-world setting, may indicate a degree of off-label use, and that would need to be picked out as well. It's worthwhile grouping together the articles that you choose to describe within this section. So if you have, say, 4 or 5 related to pregnancy, group them together. And then your MAH comments can either be at the end or individually. Sometimes it makes more sense to discuss the articles and then have an MAH comment at the end. That puts it all into perspective with what you know already and what you have on your label. And again, the important thing is, how is this information changing or adding to what we know, or changing what we know? Okay, so next section, signals. So this is quite new, as in inclusion into the PBRER. And here you're meant to talk about any new, ongoing or closed during the time period. And usually you have a table for section 15, and then you have your signal evaluation in 16.2. This is the table. Again, it's quite small, but it's a standard table from GVP, and it talks about your signal, what have you seen, when was it detected, what's the status, i.e. is it new, was it ongoing, has it been closed? If it's been closed, it can either be refuted, be a potential risk, or be an identified risk, i.e. needs to be added to the label. The date that it was closed, the source of the signal, the reason for evaluation, what you did, and what your action was overall. And usually most companies will present that and then use section 16.2 for the rest of the information. So points to consider here. You're only meant to present validated signals, so you do have to have a process in place to ensure that you can pick out your validated signals and know exactly what status they are, i.e. new, ongoing, closed for that time period. If you do have, you will have requests probably from your previous, final assessment reports, and you need to decide how they're going to be dealt with. Are they signals or are they not signals? And different companies will consider them in different ways. But you need to understand how you're going to, what you consider those requests as, so that you can put them appropriately into your document. How do you link to your other sections? So the importance here is, where you link to section 16.3, which is new information on your identified potential risks, etc. Make sure that there are appropriate links there. And then consider the time period, which is important, because if you've got a long PBRER, which covers, say, 5 years, your tracking system may only be for a year or 2 years, in which case you will have 3 years worth of, or 3 years that you need to go back and look manually to see exactly what signals were looked at and what the outcome was, because they're not on your tracking system. So you do need to bear that in mind. This is a rather helpful, unhelpful, I'm not quite sure, diagram that's actually in ICH, which is meant to help you to understand where you put your information. So when you have a signal, once you've done your analysis, you're meant to work through here and decide where it goes. It can be a bit confusing, but again, if you're putting together a process within your company, it might be worthwhile looking at the different scenarios. So if you have a signal, if you have a regulatory authority request, monitored event, reopen signal, and follow it through here so that you know where you pick your data from and also where you track things within your organization. And it makes it a little bit easier then when, say, you know, somebody says, oh, I've got a regulatory authority request, where do I put it? You can say, yeah, actually, you know, looking at how we do it in the company, you need to track it here, you need to detail it here. It's not considered a signal, therefore we will put it in section blah, blah, blah. But you probably do need to work it through within your own organisation. So moving on now to risks and new information. So again, this is section 16.3, 16.4, 16.5, and here you're meant to provide your updates on your important, potential, identified risks and and potential and identified risks not categorized as important, and your missing information as well. You're also meant to have your characterization of risks, so presenting on things like your relative risk, absolute risk as well, frequency, etc. Missing information, you tend to think of your standard kind of pregnancy, elderly, etc. But really do look at your product, because it will differ product to product. If you have a product that can be used in pregnancy, then it's not missing information, because you know that you can use it in pregnancy. So really think about what you're considering missing information. And then looking at your points to consider overall, if you have a risk management plan, then that's fine. You need, that's quite easy, because you can take the risks from there. But if you don't, which a lot of the older products don't, then you will need to really look at your label and pick out the important risks, the potential risks and the identified risks, and the missing information actually as well. You will then need to prepare the characterization, the frequency, the risk, the preventability, etc. And often it's useful to have a multidisciplinary team to do that, because in a way you're kind of doing the groundwork for an RMP. This can take a bit of time for your PBRER. It's worthwhile having consistent search terms, because you are going to have to look at this again for if you have to put an RMP into place, or if you don't have an RMP and you're just looking at it on a regular basis through your PBRER. So when you do have a risk, an important risk, it's worthwhile looking at what PTs, HLTs, SMQs you're using, and make a note of that so you can come back to that and make sure there's consistency, say next year when you come to review these risks again. Epidemiology I put here, dependent on if you don't have an RMP available and you're starting from scratch, and extremely important to get their input so that you can characterize those risks appropriately. I put literature here because you are going to, that's one thing you do need to cross-refer to, is the literature. And when you are doing your literature searches, it is really important to understand what risks you are looking for your product, and highlighting and picking out those appropriate articles to be added into this section. And like I said, you can think of significant new safety information for your product and miss information then that's relevant to your important risks and missing information, because you're not in that frame of mind. Okay, I know we're near the end, only a couple more slides left. Benefit. This is what you need to provide for benefit. Again, this is from the module. You need to look at your global approved indications. So it is only approved indications that should be described here. Normally, this is put together by the medical department or similar, but the issues that you may come across are the fact that you don't have a lot of data available. So if it's an older product, it may be that a lot of the information is slightly outdated, and you will have to look at other sources for being able to justify, or further justify, I should say, the benefit of your product, especially when other new products are available. You need to agree who's responsible for the literature searches. Normally, if the medical department are putting the section together, they will perform those searches. However, again, it may be that you might come across something from the safety side in your searches, in your literature reviews, and often it's worthwhile highlighting that that might be useful for benefit and forwarding that over to your medical colleagues. What we have seen is that you are tending to get amendments or changes to indications for older products, because guidelines have come into place, other products have come into place, and tweaking of indications are then needed. So that's something, again, to consider for benefit. Okay, I'm going to come on to these two in a second, but I've just put here some general tips. I think you need to be sure that you're picking the right information from your database. So this goes even before the PBRER format. You needed to be sure that you're pulling all the relevant cases for your product and that you were selecting the appropriate cases as well. So if you had, for example, a tick box maybe for pregnancy, make sure that's ticked and that would be pulled out for your pregnancy listing, because otherwise you'll be missing data and you will not be reviewing the appropriate data for that area that you're looking at. You do need to keep your source data and you need to keep your analyses and your assessments available. They may be requested in an inspection setting and you'll be required to produce them to show what you looked at and how you made that assessment overall. Ensure you have a process for late-breaking information and, again, common sense, use common sense. If you've got something that occurs one day after your late-breaking date, it's important, include it. Think about what would you want to see if you were a regulatory authority. Module 7 is good as guidance. I think it's quite good, to use that to help you write the document overall. And I think duplication is another issue. And certainly the feedback is that they want information covered or detailed information in one area, but use it to cross-refer to other areas. So if you've got a lot of literature articles, think up front, how am I going to deal with these? Am I just going to put them into section 11 and then cross-refer into, say, section 5 if it's about pattern of use, section 16 if it's about the risks, rather than writing a whole load in section 11 and then writing a whole load in section 16 and a whole load in section 5. I often, use a spreadsheet to help me work out where to put things, and that can be helpful. I can always, forward that on to anyone that would be interested in seeing that. And last but not least, I'll go back to these two slides. I just kind of put in here, for the different sections, who would really be responsible maybe for the content and where would you get the data from? And it's just to give you an idea perhaps of where you can go for the different data elements for these sections. So you will, I think, have access to these slides. This webinar is being recorded and you can come back to this. I'm not going to spend time going through this, but it's all about knowing who's going to be providing what and what are you looking for overall. I'm going to end there. Sorry, 5 minutes over, but are there any questions? Okay, so I've got a question here. Timeline for including late-breaking information, unable to document official reference, GVP. So I'm assuming you mean timeline. I think timeline-wise, it really is internally as to whatever policy the company has. There isn't an official timeline detailed anywhere, but it's whatever makes sense for the company. But as always, like I said, if you receive something, if you agree that you're going to have a timeline of, say, 4 weeks, 6 weeks after your data lock point, you still need to consider that if something comes in right at the end, it may be worthwhile adding that in. Does that answer your question? Typing, afraid I can't. Great, thanks. Okay, perfect. Are there any other questions? Hi, Veronica, I can see you're typing. Actually, maybe I can open this up. I'm going to try and be very brave and put it onto Q&A mode. There you go. I think you have to put your hand up, though. Don't ask me anything further about that. Oh, Veronica, yep, you got your hand up. Hi, Veronica. Can you hear me? I'm not sure if we can hear you. I'm sorry. But we've got a couple of people typing. Oh, thank you. That's very nice. Same thing. Hello.
Hi, Seema. Hello.
Yes.
I think this is Michelle. I think what we'll do is we'll end the seminar now, the webinar now. But there'll be an email address on the email that I sent through afterwards. And if anyone does have any further questions, then please feel free to fire them through, and we'll get them answered for you.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. I've got a couple of just one more thing come here. How much effort you go into reconciling the interval if the cumulative has to be corrected, for example? I think, Veronica, it just has to be. I think it's top line really. I know there are always going to be amends, but it really is top line, unless there's something specific that you know is going to create a problem where there's been an issue, perhaps in coding. Thanks, Neve. But you have got my email, you've got my phone number, give me a call, send through questions. I'll endeavour to answer what I can. If you do want to see an example, maybe of a spreadsheet to help looking at the data elements, let me know as well. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Seema.